A few years ago, while digging for records at a flea market in Beirut, I stumbled across an LP that immediately caught my attention. It was called Sultan of Baghdad, and its cover showed this guy who was dressed in some kind of goofy Alibaba costume, just kicking back and strumming his oud as two belly dancers swayed behind him. I soon learned that this album was part of a series called Music of the Middle East, released between the late 1950s and mid-1960s in the US by Audio Fidelity Records. And not surprisingly, almost all the other records in the series had similar covers that we today would consider Orientalist, sexist, and even racist. But here's the thing. These records with covers full of every Arab stereotype imaginable were in fact by an Arab artist, a Lebanese singer and musician named Mohammed El-Bakkar.
أيتها السماء أمطري
Before moving to the US and recording those albums in the 1950s, El-Bakkar actually had an extremely prolific 20-year-long career in the Middle East, as an actor, a musician, a composer, and even an opera singer. So, who exactly was Mohammed El-Bakkar? And how did he end up on these tacky album covers, going from opera in the Arab world to Orientalism in America? Mohammed El-Bakkar was born in 1913 in Beirut, where he grew up and first began studying music until traveling to Italy in 1927 to study opera in Naples as a tenor. One source has even claimed that during this time he appeared in several operas that starred the legendary tenor Beniamino Gili, though he didn't perform under the name Mohammed El-Bakkar, but instead Amadeo Bakkar. Take that with a grain of salt though. By 1931, he had returned to Beirut and launched his career as a singer and composer, capably working in both the more traditional Oriental style as well as the more European operatic style. He must have been making quite the name for himself, because in 1939, he was invited to Egypt to perform at the wedding celebration of Princess Fawzia Fuad and Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran. As a matter of fact, El-Bakkar went on right after Kulthum herself and performed some traditional Lebanese songs backed by a troupe of Lebanese dancers. And the following year, in 1940, he would relocate to Egypt for good. If his career was doing alright in Lebanon, it absolutely skyrocketed in Egypt. He started composing original songs and putting out records. And he firmly established himself in Egypt's opera scene, composing and staging several operas and operettas to the point that opera became his defining feature, like Farid Al-Atrash in 1945's Shahr Al-Asal, where he played an overly dramatic, self-obsessed opera singer, Arioka, in 1944's Nadoga, Egypt's earnest, albeit insensitive attempt at emulating the Tarzan adventure films.
هاجرت أوطاني في البحث عن بنت بيضة تاهت من أبوها من 12 سنة وكان عمرها 7 سنين ويمكن تكون هي ندوب. نادية هانم ستي نادية. نادية يا ويكا.
شاب ندوجة ما فيش نادية.
ندوجة دلوقتي لكن وانت نونو اسمك نادية. أنا متأكد إنها هي.
And even a then up-and-coming Sabah in 1947's Qalbi wa Sayfi, in which he plays a frivolous young man who learns responsibility and discipline after joining the Egyptian army.
من أمرك قبل تغني بجراءة وانت بخدمة
يا فندم غصب عني
مش عايزة اسمع ولا كلمة
ليه يا فندم
كده أوامرنا
أنا متظلم
يشكي غيرنا
لكن حضرتك بتكلميني رسمي كده ليه؟
Qalbi wa Sayfi was actually the first movie that El-Bakkar had produced himself. He invited King Farouk of Egypt to attend the premiere, and the King of Egypt actually accepted and attended. But King Farouk's days of ruling over Egypt wouldn't last for much longer.
تمام يا فندم.
From Cairo come these first authentic pictures of the bloodless coup by which the army took over control of Egypt. It was the end of the king's attempt to maintain power. Troops in the street were the first indication of the change to most people, until with the broadcasting station seized, it was announced that General Naguib, the commander-in-chief whom Farouk refused as war minister, had taken control.
According to one source, El-Bakkar felt that the Egyptian revolution of 1952 would negatively impact the opera scene in the country. He also felt that cinema was headed in a direction that didn't quite align with his own personal aspirations. Though you could also argue that he hadn't had as much luck as he'd hoped for in the world of Egyptian cinema. Despite his numerous credits and critical acclaim, El-Bakkar really only had 2 leading man roles under his belt. The rest of his on-screen appearances were limited to playing minor roles and singing the occasional musical number. He was also getting older and putting on some weight. The revolution might have just been the perfect excuse for him to pack up and go seek fame and fortune somewhere else. So in 1952, he left the Middle East altogether and moved to the United States. More specifically, he moved to New York City. Mohammed El-Bakkar was by no means the first person from the Middle East to emigrate to the United States. Nearly 100,000 Syrian and Lebanese immigrants had already made their way over there between 1870 and 1924, in what is now recognized as the first wave of Arab mass immigration to the US. El-Bakkar arrived in 1952 as part of the second wave, so by then there was already a well-established and thriving Arab-American community for him to embed himself into, especially in Brooklyn's Atlantic Avenue, where he settled down. In the late 1920s, Arab-American communities had started hosting their very own events called haflas and maharajans. Haflas were communal gatherings that were usually held in a church hall, although they weren't necessarily religious in nature, while maharajans were larger festivals held outdoors. Aside from being a good way to bring the Arab-American community together and keep its culture and traditions alive, haflas also gave Arab immigrant musicians the opportunity to perform traditional Middle Eastern music and get paid for it. For El-Bakkar, an Arab celebrity whose records and movies had already been making their way stateside by that time, getting gigs proved to be no challenge at all, so he started touring the hafla and maharajan circuit. And as luck would have it, his arrival perfectly coincided with the birth of an entirely new type of venue for Middle Eastern music in America, the Middle Eastern Nightclub. In 1952, a Lebanese-American couple opened Club Sahara in Boston, the first of many Middle Eastern nightclubs that would start popping up across the country and become the primary venue for Arabic music in America. These places were the polar opposites of haflas. Although Arab immigrants would regularly be in attendance, the audiences at these clubs predominantly consisted of middle and upper-class white Americans curious to experience Middle Eastern culture. And as for the music, authenticity wasn't necessarily a requirement. Lebanese, Turkish, Armenian, and Greek musicians were brought together to perform in a hybrid Oriental style, with Latin rhythms and jazz syncopations occasionally being thrown in. El-Bakkar was known to have performed in Club Sahara and several other nightclubs, like Club Morocco in Boston, the Shahrazad in Los Angeles, and the Fez and the Seventh Veil in New York. But it's also worth mentioning that it wasn't just white Americans who were getting turned on to Middle Eastern music at this time. With the rise of groups like the Nation of Islam in the 1930s, there had also been a growing interest in the Middle East among African Americans. A lot of African American musicians who had converted to Islam began looking towards Arabic music for inspiration, perceiving it as something more culturally authentic to what their African ancestors might have practiced and spoken. One such musician was Brooklyn-born jazz artist Ahmed Malik, a bass player who had been experimenting with the oud and the qanun since the 1940s. He had a keen interest in fusing jazz with Middle Eastern music one day, so he started hanging out in Atlantic Avenue, befriending Arab musicians and learning the principles of Middle Eastern music from them. During the 1950s, Abdul Malik was even being hired for concerts and recording sessions by a number of prominent Arab artists in New York, including El-Bakkar. Aside from the music and the cocktails, the Middle Eastern nightclubs were also where some Americans were getting their first glimpses of belly dancing. Although America's fascination with belly dancing dates back to at least 1893, the Middle Eastern nightclubs became regular venues for it in the 1950s. Another thing that further exposed belly dancing to a mainstream American audience was the 1954 Broadway musical Fanny, which featured a performance by Turkish belly dancer Necla Ateş. It also featured El-Bakkar, making his Broadway debut playing the role of a singing Oriental rug merchant.
نجلة يا حلوة يا زينة يا أحلى وردة في جنينة سمرة يا حلوة يا زينة يا أحلى وردة في جنينة هذه الخصوص هذه الخصوص كل والله
Between this Broadway musical with a sensational belly dance sequence, the popularity of Middle Eastern nightclubs, and a general curiosity about Middle Eastern culture among Americans, both white and black, it was becoming increasingly apparent that there was now a growing demand for Middle Eastern music in America. But to say that there wasn't any on the market already wouldn't be entirely true. Since as early as 1907, record labels founded by Arab immigrants had been importing, distributing, dubbing, and even locally recording Arabic music in the US. Labels like Maqsood Records, Ma'loof Records, Alam Phone Records, and Al-Sharq Records, who El-Bakkar started recording with in 1953.
أسطوانات الشرق الأستاذ محمد البكار.
لبنان محلى فياتك لبنان محلى غاباتك كل شي في جبل في المعمور غيرانا من أرزاتك.
But that stuff sounded different. It was genuine Arabic music, made for Arabs by Arab artists, not the hodgepodge of exotic sounds that Americans were going crazy for in the nightclubs. And there was also a technological aspect. Most of the Arabic music that was available was on 78 RPM records, a format that was on its way out by the late 1950s. This was a time when hi-fi stereo systems were growing in popularity and would soon be found in every living room. It was also the time when a record label by the name of Audio Fidelity would come into the picture. Audio Fidelity was founded in 1954 by Sidney Fry, presenting itself as the Audiophiles record label. In fact, their greatest claim to fame was releasing the first commercially available stereo record.
Audio Fidelity Records, producers of Stereo Disc, the world's first compatible stereophonic high-fidelity record, presents a study in stereophonic sound.
And to show off their exciting new audio innovation, the label had started releasing albums showcasing diverse musical styles from around the world, like calypso and cha-cha-cha. So the timing was just right for them to put out a record of Middle Eastern music. El-Bakkar had been recording with Al-Sharq Records for around 4 years before he was eventually approached by Audio Fidelity. They wanted him to produce a series of albums that would be released under the label Music of the Middle East. So he went into the studio with a group of musicians to record a bunch of material. And in 1957, Audio Fidelity released his full-length major label debut, Port Said. It had this visually striking cover that featured El-Bakkar's Fanny co-star, Al-Atrash, posing semi-nude with pasties over her breasts, which is not exactly traditional belly dance attire. The liner notes also painted a vivid mental picture of Port Said, describing it as this faraway, exotic land where dancing girls, quote, perform their ancient ritual for a few modest coins, and for a little more will take you into their tent or hut for more enjoyable entertainment, unquote. As for the music itself, it sounded nothing like the stuff he'd been recording back in Egypt, or even in the States with Al-Sharq for that matter. It was party music, raucous and loud, with cranked up percussion pounding and clattering away while he sang his lyrics in Arabic and belted out these long wailing mawals. Port Said was the Middle Eastern nightclub experience pressed onto a disc and packaged for mass consumption. That same year, Audio Fidelity would release his second album, Sultan of Baghdad, and then follow that up with 2 more in 1958, Music of the African Arab and The Magic Carpet. And just like Port Said, every single one of those albums had some extremely exploitative cover art and the same style of Orientalist liner notes. Although Port Said would go on to sell at least 1 million copies, the Arab American community weren't huge fans of it at the time. The music was criticized for being too loud and too fast, having more in common with rock and roll than Arabic music. Then again, they weren't exactly Audio Fidelity's target demographic here. Even his occasional band member, Ahmed Malik, might have had some critical thoughts on the record. Like many Muslim Americans at the time, Malik wasn't happy with what he saw as the vulgarization, secularization, and sexualization of Arab music. That sentiment could have been what spurred him on to finally record and release the Middle Eastern jazz fusion sound he'd been developing throughout the 50s on his own debut album, 1958's Jazz Sahara. But it wasn't like El-Bakkar got cancelled or anything like that. His career was still very much thriving. He kept getting booked for shows, working the nightclubs, touring the Hafla and Mahrajan circuit, the Sephardic Bar Mitzvah circuit, and even performing overseas in Argentina and Brazil. In fact, he would literally die while on stage. The year was 1959. El-Bakkar was set to perform for a crowd of thousands at the Rhode Island Mahrajan, the East Coast's biggest Arab American festival at the time. 2 songs into his set, he collapsed and was rushed to Memorial Hospital in Pawtucket, where doctors diagnosed him with a brain hemorrhage. He died a few days later, on September 8, at the age of 46. His obituary ran in the New York Times, and news of his death shocked thousands of Arabs and Arab Americans alike. Even well into December, businesses like the Lido Theater in Brooklyn celebrated his life by screening some of his films. After his death, Audio Fidelity would go on to release his last two records, Dances of Port Said in 1960 and Exotic Music of the Belly Dancer in 1966. It's worth mentioning, though, that by the time those albums came out, America's relationship with Middle Eastern music and culture had taken a very unexpected turn.
In New York City, where there are more belly dancers than there are in all of Egypt, more people do the jelly belly than any other kind. We must be doing something right.
Clap your hands together and gently bow. Put them over your head and I'll show you how.
Belly dancing had gone from being this thing you'd only see in certain nightclubs to a nationwide craze, a cultural phenomenon. All of a sudden, everybody wanted to belly dance.
First, you inhale. Then, you exhale. Hips go up and down, tummy round and round, shoulders shivering, everything I'm quivering. Anybody can do it. Try. Anybody can try it. Anybody can do it.
Aside from the perceived exoticism and eroticism of it, belly dancing was also being associated with health and fitness, kind of like how yoga is today.
And this is the age of the body beautiful. You can trim your figure and add excitement to your life with belly dancing. We will begin doing the movement.
And naturally, women who wanted to belly dance needed a soundtrack, so the demand for Middle Eastern music went through the roof. Or at least, the demand for music that kinda sounded Middle Eastern, which musicians from Greece, Turkey, Armenia, Lebanon, and even Americans were all more than happy to provide. This was an era of albums with names like Oriental Delight, Music of the Bedouin Bandits, and How to Belly Dance for Your Husband. But by the late 1970s, this era of belly dance and faux Oriental sounds would come to an end. The party was finally over. Fun fact: Mohammed El-Bakkar's oud is actually on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It was donated to the museum in 1988 by Rosalind K. Fry, wife of the late founder of Audio Fidelity Records, Sidney Fry. If I had to answer the question of how Mohammed El-Bakkar went from opera in the Arab world to Orientalism in America, it would seem logical for me to just point the finger at Sidney Fry and say he made him do it. After all, he was in charge of the record label that put out El-Bakkar's albums, so he probably had more control over the marketing and art direction than El-Bakkar himself did. But somehow, I don't think it's as clear-cut as that. Knowing what I know now about the era in which he arrived to the US, there's a good chance that despite being an Arab himself, El-Bakkar fully understood the appeal of these Arab stereotypes in America and was willing to use them to his advantage. And he wasn't the only one. As Professor Ann K. Rasmussen writes in her journal article, An Evening in the Orient, the Middle Eastern Nightclub in America, quote, "In their effort to explain the East to the West, the musicians, dancers, and owners of the nightclub adapted and capitalized upon a set of symbols they came to know in the Western world. As they presented a caricature of themselves that was entertaining and even familiar to American audiences, they also promoted and magnified the most salient and discriminatory features of Orientalism." Unquote. Ultimately, El-Bakkar isn't an isolated case. But what makes his story so fascinating to me are the circumstances surrounding it. Holding that record sleeve in my hands at that flea market, I would have never guessed that I was in fact looking at a Lebanese opera singer and star of Egyptian cinema and Broadway, who kicked the door open for 2 decades worth of American belly dance records, All because he was at the right place at the right time. All I could see was a guy in a costume. A costume that he and many other Arab American artists like him at that time had no choice but to put on if they wanted to make their voices heard. After learning about his story today, I hope you too can look past the costume like I did and see the man underneath it, Mohammed El-Bakkar.